From McCain Auditorium on the campus of Kansas State University in Manhattan, the K-State Radio Network presents now an address by Dr. George Gallup Jr., president of the Gallup Poll. He'll be speaking on the role of polls in a democracy. He is the 53rd speaker in the series of Landon Lectures on public issues here at Kansas State University. We'll switch now to the stage for the introductions, and Kansas State University President Dr. Dwayne Alec.
Good morning, and welcome to the 53rd Alfred M. Landon Lecture here at Kansas State University. We're pleased with the turnout this morning. We recognize the weather might have impaired the travel of a few, but we do have a number of people in the audience who've come from at least 100 miles and perhaps further. I would say, too, that last evening I received one phone call from a student who said, "Aren't you going to dismiss classes tomorrow?" Weather's pretty rough, and I said, no, with good clothes and plenty of sleep, I'm sure that students can endure, and we exist here to advance learning. And you see, even our speaker weathered the storm and some inconvenience, and in order to get here this morning, he arrived in Manhattan about 2 o'clock or 2:30. And so we appreciate very much the extra energy that our faculty, as well as our guest speakers, invest to do a good job of helping our students and others who are here this morning. First, I would like to introduce the platform participants. First of all, on your left, the person who has done an excellent job of leading the Landon Lecture series and who is finishing with this particular lecture, becoming a full-time faculty member in the Department of Economics, a person that I know you will want to express your appreciation to, Dr. Barry Flinchbaugh. Barry? And the person that is assuming the chairmanship of the Landon Lecture series, working with student and faculty leaders and the chairman of the Landon patrons and others, and certainly with me in identifying and inviting participants in this outstanding series, Dr. Bill Richter, who is director of our South Asia Center and a professor of political science, Dr. Bill Richter. The chairman of the Landon patrons, Mr. J. Robert Wilson. Mr. Wilson. On your right, the president of the Kansas State University Faculty Senate, Dr. Charles Hathaway. And a young man who today will become a lame duck, but a young man who has done and is doing, continues to do an outstanding job as student body president here at Kansas State University. Recognizing that today there is an election underway, we want to express our appreciation to Mr. Randy Tosh, the student body president. Today we're pleased to have with us one of the foremost experts on public opinion surveying in the country, the president of the Gallup Poll, George Gallup. Active with the Gallup Poll since his graduation from Princeton in 1953, first as editor, then as president, Mr. Gallup has traveled extensively around the United States in the course of gathering material on the voting behavior of various groups in the population. This material has been the subject of several published studies of voting patterns among farmers, young voters, intellectuals, blacks, and labor union members. Mr. Gallup serves on the board of directors of the Roper Public Opinion Center at Williams College. He is a member of the American Association of Public Opinion Research and the World Association of Public Opinion Research. He is co-director of the Princeton Religion Research Center and chairman of the Board of Trustees of the National Coalition for Children's Justice. This morning, Mr. Gallup will discuss the role of polls in democracy. It's my pleasure to present to you Mr. George Gallup. Mr. Gallup.
Thank you very much. Dr. Ocker, Dr. Flinchbaugh, Dr. Richter, Mr. Wilson, Dr. Hathaway, Mr. Tosh, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted and honored indeed to be here today. I'd like first of all to report to you on the nation's outlook for 1981, primarily their economic outlooks, because the economy continues to be the main preoccupation of the American people at this time. Next, I'd like to try to answer the question, is there a shift to the right or to a conservative point of view in this nation? Many observers have maintained this. I'd like to comment briefly on this. Next, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the history of the Gallup poll and the operation. Then I'd like to deal with the key question of the role of polls in a democracy. And finally, I'd like to touch on certain trends in our society which will affect you in the future, whether your role is student, teacher, businessman, or whatever your role may be. I'm going to indicate 4 trends, and I think these are rather worrisome trends. As a matter of fact, I would consider these 4 trends to be root problems in our society, if you will. But I believe that these problems can be dealt with, and the public themselves as responding to certain ways of dealing with these particular problems. Lastly, I'd like to make a few comments about the overall mood of the nation as we move through the 1980s. I'll have you out of here by 5 o'clock. I know it doesn't sound it, but before I get underway, I'd like to remind myself of a warning Adlai Stevenson once gave when initiating a commencement address. He said, "It's my job today as speaker to talk. It's your job as the audience to listen. If you get through your job before I do, please feel free to get up and leave." There's been much discussion lately on the question of whether the President's victory last November 4 represented a shift to the right among the electorate. Well, examination of political indicators and the views of voters on key issues indicate that the Reagan landslide was not so much a shift an ideological shift to the right among the electorate as it was dissatisfaction with the leadership of the nation and a desire for change. Our measurements of both the ideological stance of the electorate and public opinion on certain key issues reveal actually surprisingly little change since the presidential race of 4 years ago. For example, when Americans are asked to place themselves on the left-right continuum, the proportion who are right of center is virtually the same today as it was in the presidential year of 1976. During last year's campaign, Reagan was perceived by voters to be not only to the right of President Carter, but also to the right of where voters placed themselves on this left-right scale. Now, our previous polls in previous election years have indicated that the candidate whose perceived ideological stance more closely matches that of the electorate has fared better in the election. Actually, we need only look at the 1972 presidential race with Senator George McGovern. He was perceived as too far to the left of where voters placed themselves. Back in 1964, Senator Barry Goldwater was perceived as too far to the right. So it was actually fairly easy early in those years to indicate that these two candidates would have a very difficult time winning in November. But this time, that kind of impact was not so pronounced, as a matter of fact, which does suggest that, as I indicated, that factors other than those related to political philosophy were crucial to Reagan's victory. Now, paralleling these findings on political ideology, which indicate very little change since the 1976 presidential race, we have found also very little change in terms of how people affiliate in terms of party affiliation. As a matter of fact, the proportion of persons who describe themselves as Republicans is only up very marginally over 4 years ago. Now, not only is there no evidence of a movement, a shift in terms of political ideology and in terms of political affiliation, but we see very little change on those issues which are usually cited as ones on which liberals and conservatives diverge. And these issues would include abortion, the death penalty, the Equal Rights Amendment, gun control, and a balanced federal budget. Actually, there's very little change on these key issues over the last 4 years. The fact is, the prime reason for President Carter's defeat was growing dissatisfaction with his leadership rather than any apparent conservative swing in this country. But that's not saying this won't change, at least to some degree. As a matter of fact, it can be assumed that with a Republican in the White House, that the proportion of Republicans will gradually increase over the next 4 years. However, I don't think we can expect anything dramatic to happen. I think the Republican Party will continue to be the minority party in American politics for the foreseeable future, for a number of reasons, actually. As a matter of fact, the one-party domination of this country, totally one-party domination, was likely to continue for the immediate future. As you know, over the last half century, one party has been pretty much in control of our government, both in terms of the Senate and the House and the White House in many years, of course, too, but also at the state level, too. We've had a one-party domination for virtually all of its half century, actually. What place will the president occupy in history? Well, the president, despite his losses in terms of leadership qualities, never lost the public's perception of him as a man with strong leadership qualities, and as a man with high moral principles, as a man sympathetic to the problems of the poor, and a religious person. These traits have been ascribed to the president all throughout his 4 years in the presidency, and he has lost little ground in terms of those particular traits. At the same time, we find that only 3% of the American people describe President Carter, think he will go down in history as an outstanding president. 15% actually say poor. Now, it's also true that the lowest popularity rating ever given a president was recorded for President Carter. His popularity dipped to 21%, which was even lower than the low points given President Nixon and President Truman. Again, and the president was not the most admired man. Typically in our surveys, I'm the most admired man, and admittedly this measurement is something of a name recognition kind of measurement. The president usually is the number one most admired person. He was number 2 this year, which indicates that something of his fall from popularity. However, I think one could assume that history will treat him more favorably, because we must remember that few presidents, if any, have had to deal with so many simultaneous problems as has President Carter. And when economic problems are involved, every chief executive, of course, becomes a favorite target of disgruntled citizens. Now, how is President Reagan faring in public opinion? Well, our early findings, preliminary findings, indicate that public support is running high. I can't give you the final figures because I'm afraid you've caught me between surveys. We have a survey coming up in a few days. The results will be back. But our early evidence indicates that support is running high. But this is not surprising, as you know, because a president is usually given a grace period at the start of his presidency. As a matter of fact, President Reagan may enjoy a somewhat longer grace period than usual, since the public's expectations regarding the economy are somewhat lowered at this particular point in time. As a matter of fact, when we ask people to indicate the rate of inflation at the end of the year, what their best guesstimate is, and what the rate of unemployment may be, they're just about what they are today. So the public sees a misery index, if you will, which, as you know, is a combination of the unemployment rate and the inflation rate, of around 20% at the end of the year. They look for very little improvement. Therefore, they may be a little more generous with President Reagan's efforts to turn things around. In contrast, 4 years ago, at the beginning of the Carter presidency, large majorities of the public felt that the president would be able to reduce both inflation and unemployment. So expectations were high, and when they weren't reached, of course, the public took it out on their chief executive. And not many months after President Carter was in office, people started to say that he's losing his ability to lead the nation. Now, Despite the public's somewhat bearish outlook, well, considerably bearish outlook about the economy, their overall mood is much more optimistic now than it was at the start of 1980, at the start of 1979, and in fact, at the start of 1978. Well, that seems sort of puzzling in view of the person's bearish economic outlook, but the fact is that twice as many people think that 1981 will be better than 1980, and this refers to many other aspects of life besides the economy, than felt this way back in a year ago, I should say. Why is that? Well, first of all, the public is greeting the new presidency, even though only 27 out of every 100 people actually voted for President Reagan. The public, of course, greets a new presidency with a high level of hope and expectation. Incidentally, our outlook is much brighter. Our outlook in this country is much brighter than the outlook in many other nations of the world. In fact, we are among the most optimistic of all. Most pessimistic, you may be interested to learn, are persons are Belgians. Only 7% think 1981 will be better than 1980. West Germans, only 8% do. Austrians, 10%. Those are among the most pessimistic people in this study, which was conducted in 28 nations of the world. Now, before dealing with the four trends which I'd like to discuss, actually, that I mentioned earlier, the four root problems in our society as I see them, based on surveys, I would like to talk to you a little bit about the operation of the Gallup Poll. The poll was founded in Princeton, New Jersey by my dad, who is still vigorous and active, I'm happy to say. Actually, my dad's experience goes back to the 1920s. He did some polling for my grandfather's race in Iowa. My grandfather ran on the Democratic ticket in Iowa. His name was Alexander Miller, my mother's father. My dad did some polling on his race. Well, being a Democrat in Iowa at that time, of course, he didn't have a chance of winning, and he didn't. He lost handily. And so they put my grandmother on the ticket to run next time as sort of an honor. And everybody, thought it was a joke. Nobody expected her to win, but she did. And as a matter of fact, she won very handily and swept back into office with FDR's sweep in 1936. She was, as a matter of fact, you might be interested to learn, the first female Secretary of State in this country. She also started the first state police, as a matter of fact. So my dad's polling experience really goes back to the 20s and in the early 30s, and he did some experimenting on the 1934 congressional race and was only a point off from what the actual result was in that election. So in 1935, the Gallup Poll opened its doors. Now, the first big test came in 1936, as certainly Mr. Landon would well remember. In the digest, here was a real test of two different kinds of polls, actually. One poll which assumed accuracy would come from enormous numbers of people being interviewed. And the other kind of survey based on much smaller but representative samples, such as the Gallup Poll. Here is a real test. The Literary Digest had had a terrific record right up to 1936. But in 1936, for the first time, political divisions followed economic divisions. And so the Literary Digest, in selecting their sample from persons who own telephones or cars, was obviously reaching too high an upscale group in the sample. And so, as you well know, they were way, way off the base. As a matter of fact, the Digest's final report, based on 2,376,523 ballots, pointed to a resounding Landon victory, with Republican margins in 32 states and a total of 370 electoral votes. The Literary Digest gave Mr. Landon 57% of the major party vote. As you know, in the election, President Roosevelt won a resounding victory, winning 62.5% of the major party vote and a colossal majority of 523 votes out of a possible 531 electoral votes. So that had hurried up the demise of the Literary Digest, that failure. It wasn't actually totally responsible for it, but it contributed to it, actually. It was a classic confrontation, and I just want to read you something that my dad wrote in a book called The Pulse of Democracy. My dad had the temerity to indicate how far off the track the Literary Digest would be. This did not sit too well with the editors of the Literary Digest, and one of them wrote, excuse me, I beg your pardon. Let me just read this item here, actually. On July 12, George Gallup warned his subscribers that the Digest's old-fashioned methods would point to the wrong man. Almost as an afterthought, he mentioned that its totals would show about 56% for Landon, 44% for Roosevelt. Inasmuch as the poll was not to begin for 6 weeks, Wilfred J. Funk, he was the editor of the Literary Digest, was obviously outraged. Never before has anyone foretold what our poll was going to show even before it started. He snapped. Our fine statistical friend should be advised that the Digest would carry on, quote, with those old-fashioned methods that have produced correct forecasts exactly 100% of the time. One of my dad's most accurate forecasts was the forecast of how far off the Literary Digest would be. Because in that election, as I indicated earlier, economic divisions, political divisions followed economic divisions, and their sample was clearly, the Literary Digest sample was clearly skewed toward the upscale groups. Now, the next big test for the polling industry came in 1948. I needn't remind you, I'm sure. The basic problem there was that we stopped polling too soon. There were lots of factors involved in polling organizations being off the track, but that was the primary one. We were unable to catch the collapse of the third-party vote in that particular election. As you know, traditionally, the third-party vote collapses in the closing days of a campaign. This has always been the case during this century. But we stopped polling too soon, so didn't catch that collapse, and many of those votes went over to Harry Truman. Plus, there was a drop in the farm prices in the Midwest, and many normally Republican voters shifted over to the Democratic side in the closing days of the campaign. Well, we learned our lesson too late. We polled much closer to the election, and perhaps, as I'll indicate a little later, maybe we still haven't quite learned that lesson because we stopped polling a little too early this last November 4, and I'll go into that briefly, shortly. There were many, many stories that made the rounds, of course, after the 48 election, and one of my favorite stories, and this is a true one, was the one about my dad who was in San Francisco shortly after the 1948 election, and he was going down a one-way street the wrong way, and a policeman flagged him down, took one look at his license and said, "Wrong again." In 1949, we expanded the Gallup poll to 14 nations, and now we operate in 35 nations of the world. I think one of the most interesting studies we've ever undertaken was one in 60 nations. We modestly called it the study of mankind. Actually, we did cover 90% of this available world, as a matter of fact. We are now engaged in a study on values in 12 nations, and this, I think, will prove to be one of the most interesting studies we've ever undertaken. We've not been able to get behind the Iron Curtain. In fact, we only have had very modest success in that department, and that goes back to 1958 when we cabled Radio Moscow to see if they wanted to participate in a survey on Premier Khrushchev's visit to the United States. Well, we got back a flood of telegrams, and we added up the opinions, and they came out 97% in favor and 3% undecided. We had to work very hard to get the undecided. Well, it's not exactly a scientific breakthrough, but I thought it might be of some interest. Within the last 5 years, we've started some new organizations. I should point out, first of all, that most of our work is in the area of market research. 80 to 85% of our work is done for private clients, not political clients, incidentally. We don't do any private political work, though obviously we poll on the political scene many, many times, frequently. And these releases for the Gallup Poll, are reported in 150 newspapers around the country. But we also have an organization called Gallup Youth Surveys, which is an ongoing survey of teenagers. We started an organization called the Gallup Organization Economic Service within the last 5 years. And I started an organization 4 years ago called the Princeton Religion Research Center. This happens to be a particular interest of mine because I've long felt that the most neglected area in terms of surveys is the area of one's religious and spiritual life. We know really very little about how people are putting their religious beliefs into practice, what they know about their faith, we know very little about how people structure their prayer life. There's only very limited information, most of it in the area of church membership, church attendance. Well, we're trying to redress that situation, and in the last few years we've undertaken a number of national surveys, which I think are giving church leaders and others in society as a whole a good insight into what is really going on underneath the surface in people's lives. Now, I won't go into sampling at this point because of the time restrictions, but as you well know, a sample, in order to be a good sample, must be representative of the entire populace. In other words, we must develop a microcosm of the entire adult population, or whatever population we are polling. We interview merely 1,500 in any given national survey, but with this size sample and using what we call a modified probability sampling procedure, the figures we obtain can be assumed to be within 2 or 3 percentage points of the results we would get from interviewing everybody in the United States. As a matter of fact, you can get a very accurate sample with only 300 people if they're carefully selected, and if the polling process or procedure rests firmly on the premise that each person should have an equal chance of being selected. Just let me give you a quick example. Let's say the 155 million Americans were listed in a giant telephone book in this country, and we needed to get 1,500 interviews. That happens to be the unit best suited to our needs. Well, we could divide the 1,500 into that total 155 million people, and if we kept the same interval, you would have a perfect sample if you were able to reach that person. If you'd look at the background characteristics of those 1,500 people, they would match up almost exactly with known census data. Well, that's a very simplified version of what we do, but in local telephone surveys, of course, that can be the procedure too. I don't want to take much time in questionnaire design because I want to move on to some of these major trends we're seeing in society, but suffice to say that in the area of questionnaire design that we feel that there should be a new emphasis on trying to determine what people know about a given issue. It's terribly important to separate informed from uninformed opinion, of course. Some polling organizations neglect to do this. We sometimes neglect to do this, but it's absolutely vital to develop questions which will separate the informed from the uninformed. Most of our interviewers are women. As a matter of fact, about 90% are. They have proved over the years to be better in interviewing, and as a matter of fact, their record for honesty is better too, both here and abroad. Now, as you can imagine, there have been some amusing situations in which interviewers have found themselves. Interviews have been conducted in a rowboat during a flood, where incredible situations come up, and sometimes the definitions or the responses given by survey respondents make the load of an interviewer, lighten the load of an interviewer, make his life more interesting. I think you may find these definitions amusing. One person thought that a plebiscite is a bug. Another thought that nostalgia is a nasal condition. Still another person, survey respondent, thought that cyclamates who live together should get married. And we asked one young homeowner how she felt about the double standard in matters of sex, and she replied, "I'm all in favor of it. Standards should be twice as high where sex is concerned." We've covered an enormous range of topics, as you can imagine. We are just doing a study on out-of-body experiences, if you will, if you're familiar with discussion about those. Obviously, we poll on the key issues of the day, but some of the more unusual topics include a survey on UFOs. We found that 11% of people say they've seen what they thought was a UFO, including a man who was certain he'd seen a UFO because he saw the letters UFO on the side of the vehicle. Now, regardless of what we poll on, we're certain to get static from certain quarters. Doesn't matter what the topic is. Recently, I received a letter which came addressed to George Gallup, American Institute of his own opinion. And the message was, "Dear Dr. Gallup, on what do you bias your opinion?" But I think we have a big scrapbook of some very funny items, but I think the best of all goes way back. And this goes back to, at the time we did a survey of the people in Louisiana, to find out what they thought about Louisiana politics and elections, specifically about Earl Long. Well, one survey, this particular survey, was not exactly warmly received by the Long supporters, and the official Long newspaper, the American Progress, was eloquent in its condemnation of the poll. And this I'm quoting here from the newspaper. 3 months ago, a half-dozen postgraduate social science workers, in quotes, from Princeton University, augmented by 7 or 8 East Side New Yorkers who had never in their lives seen a possum, tasted a sweet potato, or chewed a plug of tobacco, arrived in New Orleans to conduct a so-called, quote, survey of public opinion, end quote. After taking a few sightseeing trips, getting some fancy grub at the famous restaurants in New Orleans, looking at some swamps, and sending picture postcards back home, they then wrote some mystic figures in their little black books and hurried back to their boss, a low-ceiling guy with bifocal glasses who sits enthroned way up there in Princeton, New Jersey like the Wizard of Oz and peers owlishly at figures all day long until he looks like a left-handed figure 4. I think that's a classic myself. Now, I'd like to, before moving on, I'd like to make a few comments about election surveys and the record of polls in the last election. What happened to the polls? A lot of people feel that polls fell flat on their face. Well, some polls indeed were far off the mark and greatly underestimated the vote for Reagan. Shortly after the presidential election, Johnny Carson announced that there were 3 polls out of work as a result of the election: Harris, Gallup, and Brzezinski. Well, I'm happy to report we are still in business. To be sure, the deviation of our final pre-election survey results from the actual vote giving the winning candidate was larger than our usual deviation. Actually, we've been within 1 percentage point over the last 12 years, actually. And this particular time, it was 3.7 percentage points. And this, of course, is larger than the average deviation of 2.3 percentage points for 23 national elections since 1936. But I should add that our figures on Reagan were the closest of all to the actual Reagan vote. But the fact that we were so far off, really, in our best estimation, is not due to some flaw in the polling mechanism, but primarily to the fact that we stopped polling on Saturday in order to prepare our final report and did not catch the continuing trend to Reagan that had been building during the week following the presidential debate. The presidential debate stopped Carter's momentum cold, and Mr. Reagan started to pick up strength at the rate of about 1.3 million votes per day. All during that final week, we charted his strength rising very strongly. On the eve of the debate, both men were about equal, but then Mr. Reagan started to move very quickly on. The hostage situation over the weekend, and I should point out that many people felt that, at least a third of voters felt that the President Carter, had timed that for political purposes. So there was a lot of cynicism at that particular stage, too, plus a lot of dashed hopes, dashed expectations. And so this all accrued to Mr. Reagan's benefit. I think one of the more interesting things is that this election indicates that presidential debates, for the 3rd time since 1960, have played a very decisive role in the outcome of an election. They certainly did in 60. They did in 1976. As a matter of fact, President Ford's momentum was fatally stalled by that second debate, and Mr. Carter moved right on and never lost ground from that point on. Polling on elections, it presents enormous problems for us. We have to find out how many people are actually going to get to the polls. We have to find out how the undecided vote's going to go. Tremendous problems. And so the question is, why do we continue to do it? Well, first of all, we've done it because, of course, election surveys provide the acid test of a poll's methodology. It's a perfect chance for poll skeptics, poll watchers to match up our final pre-election survey figures with the actual election results. However, we do, quite frankly, see no great social value in the horse race kind of poll, the trial heat, the test election race. The great value is that they help us in terms of developing the appropriate methodology. But in the future, I think we will concentrate more on defining public opinion on the eve of the election, and indeed we've done obviously a great deal of that. Now, getting to the key question of the role of polls in democracy. You hear many criticisms. People say that polls create a bandwagon effect, they distort opinion, they are misused by politicians and leaders in government. But the fact of the matter is that without polls, we really would not have a good gauge of where the public stand on key issues. We like to think of polls as a sort of ongoing referendum on the key issues of the day. And by no other means can one determine week to week where people are standing on given issues. And not only how they vote, but what they know about an issue, what their top priorities are, how they'd react to various proposals. We can look at public opinion in many dimensions and get a very accurate fix on public opinion. I think you would agree that that's possible because of our election survey results over the years. Many people feel that you can read the results in elections, actually. Well, it's true in certain elections where referenda, or in certain referenda elections, and that's an increasing trend, of course, in this country, and I think it's a good trend myself. But other than that, you really do not have a way to determine public opinion on issues of the day. Traditionally, elections have been misread as meaning a mandate for this or that. Almost invariably, they're misread. So I think we perform a very important function of defining public opinion, indicating what people are worried about, what they're fearful of, what they're willing to work at, how they respond to various proposals. I think one of the most valuable uses of polls in a democracy is in terms of measuring public reaction, public acceptance or rejection, if you will, to new proposals. Polls offer an opportunity to trial balloon new ideas. The old trial balloon method of sending out messages through the newspapers and getting sort of an informal response, and sometimes not a very well-directed response, back through the media or through group discussions and so forth, really did not get an accurate fix on how people are reacting to various proposals. Now, through surveys, we can accurately go to the public in the matter of days and find out how they are reacting to a wide range of proposals, whether they accept it or reject it, how they feel about it, what do they know about it. So I think that this is probably the most valuable use of polls, and I feel that this will be the big use of polls in the future, testing out public reaction to a wide range of responses, trial ballooning new ideas. I think this is a rather untapped use of polls, and I predict that it'll be much more used in the future. Now, hurrying on, because I know that I'm running to the end of my time, I'd like to talk about these four root problems, very briefly, underlying problems or root problems, if you will, because I think they'll indicate that how polls can define the public will, can help us find out what the public knows about certain areas, can find out if the public's willing to work to solve these problems, and what they know about these particular problems too. So I think that this will indicate how polls can be very useful in a democracy in helping define a particular problem, which we may sense and feel, but we may not have the accurate information we need on these particular problems. Certainly looking at today, one could certainly ask, is there a basis for being hopeful about the future? At times we seem to live in a no-win era, when problems do not yield to solutions. Well, I don't have to give you the litany of discouraging findings, which we're recording every day, actually, in terms of crime and lawlessness, in terms of drug and alcohol use, though I will be dealing with these shortly. But let me get right to these problems, these root problems, if you will, and I'll do so briefly. First of all, voter apathy I see as one of the major problems facing this country. I think we can predict that the 1980s will likely be a decade in which we maintain our record as the nation with the worst voting record of any major democracy in the world. The fact is, voter apathy is likely to be with us for many years unless certain basic reforms, and these are reforms long sought by the American people, are brought about in our country. And young people will continue to reject the thought of going into politics because of the staggering costs involved in getting into office and staying there. Politics is the number 34 career choice of teenagers today. It's a very sad situation. Americans are badly out of tune with their political system. I hardly need tell you that. Only about half of U.S. citizens can name their own congressman. Fewer still know where he or she stands on issues. Well, what can be done? Certainly one step that we should consider is instituting basic changes in our electoral process, which would make it more feasible and attractive to run for Congress or the Senate or the presidency. Our method of choosing the president really is no more elaborate, in fact, is far less elaborate and well constructed than the methods we go by to elect the president of a university or a president of a company. That process is much more sophisticated and well developed. Well, now, if left to the American people, they would completely revamp the entire electoral process. They'd do away with the Electoral College. They'd substitute a nationwide primary for the present system. They'd shorten the campaigns. They'd limit the campaigning to debates. They'd elect the vice president by popular vote. They'd put tighter limits on campaign spending. And perhaps most importantly, they would limit the terms of senators and representatives in the belief that politics should be a period of service and not a career. The last, many feel, is the key reform. When politicians make politics a career, they need to do everything they can to stay in office. And this, as you well know, can too often mean shady financial dealings, false promises, and the rest. Speaking of political involvement, I've always liked President Eisenhower's advice. Politics should be the part-time profession of every citizen. Secondly, and moving on quickly, drug dependency. I think this is the number 2 root problem in this country, in my estimation, from all I can see, the evidence I can see through surveys. All of our surveys on this subject, on the subject of drinking and drug dependency, point to the inevitable conclusion that alcohol abuse, already our number 2 health problem, is growing in seriousness. And unless dramatic and creative steps are taken, we can accurately predict that the 1980s will be affected to an even greater degree than the 1970s by this drug. And I'd like to focus on alcohol, although our surveys show an alarming increase in drug use as well, other drug use. It has been estimated that alcohol may be involved in up to 1/3 of all suicides, half of all murders, and 1/4 of all other accidental deaths. The abuse of alcohol is, as you well know, a contributing factor to divorce, broken homes, child abuse, as well as a host of other problems. And as you know, alcohol is reported to be related to half of all traffic fatalities. We find that 1 person in 5 is willing to admit to having driven when they've had too much to drink to drive safely, and the percentage is much higher among young males. The trends are not encouraging. Our surveys, for example, reveal that the proportion of Americans who say liquor has been a cause of trouble in their homes has doubled in just half a decade. Now that is a very dramatic trend. We usually don't record trends of those dimensions. Moving now quickly on to the 3rd point, root problem, and I could deal more with that, the number 2 problem, as I mentioned, if you'd like, in terms of giving you figures in the question and answer period, but I'm running out of time, so I'm going to have to move along quickly. Number 3, and I think this is probably the biggest problem, it seems to me, in our society, and that's youth unemployment. And as you well know, youth unemployment among young people, unemployment among young people is shockingly high. And increased, as you well know, such a youth unemployment rate brings with it an increased crime rate, as well as an increasing burden on every community service. For example, fire protection, health facilities, drug control. These are among the costs of persistently high unemployment rates. Now, the problem is not only unemployment, but a pervasive feeling among young people of being a liability to society. What can be done about youth unemployment? Well, let's be frank. Efforts to date have not been very effective in dealing head-on with this very basic problem in our society. One approach that merits close attention is the reinstitution of training camps such as the CCC camps of the 1930s. And we might learn from other nations. For example, in certain countries there are what is called continuation schools. Instead of going to college, a young person learns a vocation 2 or 3 days of the week, but takes traditional courses the other 2 or 3 days to provide a broader background. Grades are given and certificates are given for completion of the work. In my view, it is essential that the nation open a full-scale debate on national service. Fortunately, there is renewed discussion in Washington over programs of national service. The Committee for the Study of National Service sums up its case with this statement: until the spirit of service is restored among American citizens, the most pressing human problems of our society will not be solved. The full participation of youth in national service would be a powerful force in its case with this statement. Until the spirit of service is restored among American citizens, the most pressing human problems of our society will not be solved. The full participation of youth in national service would be a powerful force in meeting the needs of the nation and in strengthening the spirit of service. Today, little is asked of young people except that they be consumers of goods and services. A vast industry serves youth with schooling, entertainment, and goods of all kinds, but there are limited opportunities for the young themselves to produce goods and serve others. There are certainly other advantages in national service, and proponents of national service feel that such a program should be part of the educational process, enabling young persons to experience the real world, if you will. Others favor it as a way to provide special training to young men who do not plan to go to college, and still others like the concept because they feel it would give young people a better and more realistic view of the social problems of America while offering them an opportunity to do something about them. And of prime importance, national service would deal head-on with one of the most basic and intractable problems of our times, youth unemployment. Now, how does the public feel about national service? Well, they overwhelmingly favor voluntary national service, but they also overwhelmingly favor a program of mandatory national service, requiring every young man to give 1 year of service, every young man 18 and older to give 1 year of service to his country, either in military or non-military work. Now, those who opt for non-military work is a far higher proportion than those who opt for military. But a high enough percentage would opt for the military to automatically fill the ranks of the military with highly qualified people. That would be one of the fringe benefits, if you will. As far as the public is concerned, and I'm talking about people of all ages, the concept, the idea, the program of national service, of mandatory national service, is an idea whose time is long overdue. Finally, I'd like to discuss briefly, very briefly, what is I consider to be the fourth root problem in our society. And I would see this as spiritual neglect and moral lethargy. We polled the nation's clergy recently, and we found that at least half the clergy see only a vague religiosity in this country without much real substance operating in our lives. Now, I'll be talking briefly about trends among Christians. The proportion of Jews in any given sample and persons of other non-Christian religious faiths are not included because the proportion is too small to provide projectable data in our sample. I think our religious faith has lost much of its power to impel us to creative action and to provide a solid value system because of three trends which are very worrisome in my view. One, a decline in spiritual discipline. Two, a decline in religious knowledge. And three, a misunderstanding of the true meaning of religious experience, which is sometimes confused with emotionalism and phenomenology. Our religious convictions and commitment are weak because we are often unclear about what we believe and why we believe. Therefore, how can we expect religion to have an important impact on our lives and on society? I have a host of suggestions that could be made for religious leaders, clergy, and other leaders in society and how to bring back some of these religious values into the lives of people of all ages, but I simply don't have time to deal with them at this point, but I perhaps could later. But I think you will agree that social engineering alone, unless accompanied by spiritual renewal, is not enough. Ethical humanism or a vague Christian religiosity, many feel, does not have the power to transform society. Now, I'm afraid I've depressed you somewhat with the trends I've reported this morning. I know I may remind you of the British diplomat who cabled back from Africa. The gravity of the situation is impossible to exaggerate, but I'll try. I've dealt with some depressing trends, but there are some very, very encouraging trends too. And in conclusion, I'd just like to mention these. I don't have to remind you, of course, of the monumental achievements of our society, the fantastic strides in medicine, reduction in poverty, the availability of a college education. But there have also been remarkable changes in attitudes of Americans over the decades we have been polling, and these are changes which haven't made the headlines in their newspapers necessarily, but they're very profound nevertheless. And certainly one of the most encouraging trends in the social history of the last half century, as measured by surveys, has been the decline in prejudice toward persons of different races, creeds, and colors. What about the overall mood of the public? Americans may be apprehensive about the future, but they're far from despondent. We continue to have a great deal of confidence in the future of the nation, and we do so for three reasons, and these arose in a survey. First of all, we have survived difficult periods in the past. Secondly, we have shown that we have the capacity to change. And thirdly, each of us knows that there is a great deal we can do to bring about change in our communities and to better society as a whole. Few of us in America, in fact, would disagree with what Thomas Wolfe has written about the promise of America. To every man his chance, to every man regardless of his birth, his shining golden opportunity. To every man the right to live, to work, to be himself, and to become whatever his manhood and his vision can combine to make him. This is the promise of America. Thank you very much.
You've been listening to an address by Dr. George Gallup Jr., president of the Gallup Poll, speaking on the role of polls in a democracy. Dr. Gallup, the 53rd speaker in the distinguished series of Landon Lectures on Public Issues, speaking from McCain Auditorium on the campus of Kansas State University in Manhattan. The program was produced by Extension Radio Television Film at Kansas State University. Our engineers, Del Staub and Lynn Parker. I'm Ralph Titus, and this is the K-State Radio Network.